to welcome you to the second day of Encuentros, artistic exchange between the U.S. and Latin America. This symposium is the third in a series of 5 Terra Symposium on American art in a global context, organized by the Smithsonian American Art Museum with generous funding from the Terra Foundation for American Art. We are very pleased to continue our discussion today with a series of talks that will be focused on the 20th century. The papers presented will consider the importance of travel and border crossings to artists in the 20th century and their roles in promoting transnational exchange. We will also consider the place of workshops and art schools in facilitating encuentros, and the centrality of cities like New York in bringing together artists from disparate regions in a rich and productive dialogue. And now I'd like to ask you to please turn off your cell phones, and we will welcome to the stage our first speaker. Mary Kate O'Hare is Associate Curator of American Art at the Newark Museum, where she has organized several exhibitions, including Constructive Spirit, Abstract Art in South and North America, 1920s to 1950s. Her research focuses on U.S. and Latin American modern and contemporary art, with particular attention to modes of artistic exchange between artists in the Americas. She is an adjunct faculty member at Rutgers University, where she earned a Ph.D. in art history. O'Hare currently holds a fellowship at the Clark Art Institute, where she is working on an interdisciplinary exhibition that explores Brazilian modernist art, music, and design. Please welcome Mary Kate.
So I would like to echo the acknowledgments from yesterday to the organizers for this conference. And on a personal note, I would also like to acknowledge Rafael Romero for his research assistance that he provided me while I was in Caracas, working in part on this paper. In August 1952, the Primera Muestra Internacional de Arte Abstracto, or the first international exhibition of abstract art, opened at Caracas's Galeria Cuatro Muros, the Four Walls Gallery. Organized by Alejandro Otero and the journalist José Hernán Briceño, the exhibition included works by a number of international abstract artists, including Albert Bertrand, Omar Carreño, Ralph Coburn, Georges Cossacks, and Carmelo Arden-Keene. The exhibition, which was displayed in 2 parts due to its scale, explored the idea of unity in art. The unity in question was a desire to connect abstract painting and sculpture with the architectural environment, but the title also conveyed a longing to connect with artists from around the world. My talk today considers the work of 2 participants in the first international exhibition of abstract art, the Venezuelan artist Alejandro Otero and the US artist Ellsworth Kelly. A painter and sculptor, as well as a gifted writer, Otero advocated a progressive art based on color and rhythm that would reflect the modernization of mid-20th century Venezuela and contribute to positive social change. Kelly, too, works in a range of media, and while he does not tie his work to any overt social project, he has pursued an art that distills observation of the natural world into poetic explorations of color and space. These 2 pioneers of post-war abstraction exerted considerable influence on their contemporaries and advanced abstract art to new levels. Today, I will focus on Kelly and Otero's work from the late 1940s and 1950s. This period corresponds to a time of geographical concurrence between the 2, when each was living in Paris. Otero from 1945 to 1952, and Kelly from 1948 to 1954. During these years, Otero and Kelly, born just 2 years apart, 1921 and 1923 respectively, were familiar with one another. Although language barriers may have limited their personal interaction, each was certainly acquainted with the other's work. While this overlap in awareness suggests an initial rationale for considering them together, there are deeper conceptual affinities that link them. Acutely attuned to matters of perception and the environment, Kelly and Otero created paintings and sculptures that embody their shared desire to unite art with architecture, an objective that relates their work to concerns occupying many abstract artists and art critics at the time. Considering the affinities and differences between Otero and Kelly affords us a deeper understanding of post-war abstraction and allows us to reflect on two of the America's most significant 20th century artists in a new and interconnected light. My interest in the relationship between Kelly and Otero's work is one that was shared by the Venezuelan art historian and photographer Alfredo Bulton. Offering a corrective to art historical accounts that had largely left Otero and many Latin Americans out of narratives of post-war abstract art, Bulton, in his book on the artist, equates Otero's breakthrough into abstraction with Kelly's more recognized innovations. Bulton's underlying point is that the critical and historical record has privileged US abstraction, specifically abstract expressionism and minimalism, giving scant attention to Latin American contributions. This is, of course, however, rapidly changing as we see in our conference the last 2 days, and also reflective as we see the growth in Latin American art studies through major publications and major exhibitions. And I would also like to point out that with regard to histories of US abstraction, the earlier breakthroughs into geometric non-figurative art from the 1930s and 1940s are typically ignored or devalued in favor of the mid-century movements. So just one of the results of this dominance that's been given to post-war US abstraction is that history has largely disregarded parallels and fundamental connections that existed between artists from South and North America. A key nexus that facilitated many of these connections was the city of Paris. Recent studies, such as the 2007 exhibition, The Geometry of Hope, Latin American Art from the Patricia Phelps de Cisneros collection, have affirmed the city as one of the centers for the development of Latin American abstraction. But post-war Paris was home to many expatriate artists from all over the world who, like Otero and Kelly, were interested in abstraction and the integration of the arts. The fact that Otero and Kelly were drawn to Paris in the 1940s is not surprising. Each was looking to escape the artistic provincialism of contemporary Caracas or Boston, and Paris, though recovering from the war, remained the great symbolic center of artistic modernity. Part of what made it so dates to earlier in the century, when Paris became a vital destination for artists working in geometric abstraction, as demonstrated by the founding in 1929 of the artist group Cercle et Carré, headed by Michel Suffeur and Joaquin Torres Garcia. 2 years later, it was succeeded by Abstraction Création, a large international association whose members, that included Mondrian, Elion, Van Tongerloo, and many others, were united by their devotion to non-figurative art and refutation of surrealism. In 1939, the group began hosting annual exhibitions, and after the war, beginning in 1946, this promotion of abstraction was carried on by the annual Salon de la Réalité Nouvelle. The salon displayed the work of many European and South and North American artists, including members of abstract artist groups from Argentina, such as the MADI and the Asociación Arte Concreto Invención, from Venezuela, Los Disidentes, and from the United States, the American Abstract Artists. And I'm showing you here some images that were reproduced in the journal Arte d'Aujourd'hui. And just for example, you could see here, just in terms of the international scope of these exhibitions, you could see a painting by the American artist Albert Eugene Gallatin right here, juxtaposed with a work by the elusive Rod Rothfuss, among many others. Kelly and Otero were among the participants in various of these salons while they lived in Paris. But both also sought alternatives to the salon, which by the early 1950s had come to militantly define abstraction as concrete art, meaning a pure geometrical style of abstraction that makes no reference to natural forms. Among the other galleries supportive of abstract art at the time was the Gallery Denis René, which brought together the work of Calder, Soto, Duchamp, Vasarely, and many others in the famous Le Mouvement exhibition of 1955. Neither Kelly nor Otero, however, had much interest in this gallery, seeing their work as fundamentally distinct from the kinetic types of abstraction that were more commonly shown there. Although it should be said that Kelly did submit his work for consideration to be accepted by the artist at the Denis René's gallery, but he was actually rejected. Yet there were other galleries more aligned to Otero and Kelly's interests. The Progressive Gallery Arnaud, launched in 1951, was a new space in the 6th arrondissement that focused on emerging abstract artists. And many of the artists that Kelly and Otero associated with in Paris exhibited at Arnaud, including the Venezuelans Omar Carrillo and Carlos Gonzalez Bogen, and the US artists Jack Junkerman, Ralph Coburn, and Kelly himself. And on the left is an installation view of Kelly's exhibition at Arnaud. The exclusive Gallery Mate, which opened its Paris branch in 1946, was open to newer trends in abstraction, showing in the early 1950s Otero's Cafeteras series and Kelly's work in its Tendance exhibitions. It is clear that in Paris, Otero and Kelly overlapped in various ways as they navigated the contemporary gallery networks and artistic milieu. Although Kelly has been hesitant to publicly acknowledge any association with Otero, Jack Junkerman, who was very close with Kelly in Paris, has recalled his own familiarity with the Venezuelan abstract artists working in Paris at the time. Otero was forthcoming about his admiration of Kelly. Looking back, he recalled, "The one who had the most impact on us in a rather serious way was Ellsworth Kelly. He was the most mature then." But for the remainder of my talk, I will not be concerned with establishing any direct influence that may or may not have existed between Kelly and Otero, but rather with positioning their works in exchange. A fundamental concern that connects Kelly and Otero on intellectual and aesthetic levels was their ambition for integration between art and architecture. Both engaged in a process of abstracting elements of the real world to create purely non-figurative works. This sensitivity informed an artistic worldview that linked their works to the environment and underpinned their aesthetic ambition for artistic synthesis. We can see the foundations for this work, for this view, in their early Paris easel paintings that explore problems of space and structure. Kelly and Otero were both captivated by Romanesque architecture and sculpture, and in fact, Otero even cited this as one of the main reasons why he wanted to come to Europe. And on the left, I'm showing you Kelly's own snapshot of the Cathedral of Notre Dame la Grande Poitiers, which he snapped in 1949. And there are many photos. He took many photographs of Romanesque sculpture and architecture. In addition to medieval architecture, both artists also shared a passion for one of the great icons of the Northern Renaissance, Grunewald's Isenheim altarpiece. And according to Kelly, the very first thing he did when he arrived in Paris was to actually leave Paris in order to go and see the altarpiece in person. The large scale and architectural-like form of the altarpiece must have appealed to both of them. And each connected his interest in Grunewald to his appreciation for Picasso's Expressionism. A profound influence on both, Picasso's work was being widely exhibited in Paris at the time. And I'm just showing you a few examples of works that both Otero and Kelly actually specifically mentioned. The top two pieces by Picasso, Otero talked about in letters with Alfredo Bulton, and the La Cuisine, the bottom here, is a work that Kelly mentioned as being particularly enamored with. Picasso's impact on Otero is evident in a series of paintings he created between 1946 and 1948 that came to be known as the cafeteras, or coffee pots. These works are filled with loose and sketchy brushstrokes that are contained or overlaid by a scaffold of lines that are often black, but at times red, blue, and other colors that form geometric shapes. Although the coffee pot series were based on a variety of household objects, including pitchers, casserole dishes, and lamps, and the shadows they cast, Otero was not interested in depicting the objects themselves, but rather in exercising aesthetic reduction, what Bulton described as Otero's process of decomposition, as well as in investigating dynamic relationships between forms and space. The compositions, with their multiple and simultaneous viewpoints and silhouettes, move toward flatness. As Otero explained, it's a space where there is practically no top, no bottom, no right or left, certainly no horizon line. The coffee pots are the foundation for Otero's subsequent explorations of space and structure, both internally and externally. Kelly's early work also reveals him working through Picasso's lessons and cultivating his close observation of the natural and man-made world. Paintings like roofs show him parsing out the underlying structure of architecture, while Romanesque heads suggest the dual influences of medieval statuary and Cubism. Desis, too, also evokes Picasso, in which Kelly reduces a traditional Byzantine iconic representation of Christ flanked by Mary and John the Baptist to just black lines against a white background. Two richly textured paintings from 1949, Kilometer Marker and Mendieta, reveal Kelly adapting three-dimensional forms he saw on the facade of the cathedral at Poitiers and along a roadside into flattened abstract shapes that intimate architectural structure. In 1950, Otero and Kelly both found their individual voices as they broke free from Picasso's influence. In the case of Otero, that year he began the radically monochromatic groups of works known as líneas inclinadas, or slanted lines, filled with thick and chunky passages of white paint that lend some of the paintings a near relief quality. Canvases are punctuated by oblique red, blue, and yellow lines. These lines suggest what Luis Perez Oramas has described as traces or silhouettes of forms perceived from the world. Ultimately, the líneas reveal Otero's focus on aesthetic essentials, a removal of excess in order to get to the essence of art. And a similar effect emanates from Kelly's Lacombe 1, the first in a series of 3 related paintings. It evolved out of Kelly's observation of shadows cast upon a set of exterior steps. After dividing the canvas into 9 rectangles, Kelly painted the shadows as red zigzagging lines against a pure white background, visually unifying the steps across a flat plane. The steps and shadows have been abstracted through his creative use of color and his removal of all suggestion of depth. The large scale of these works is difficult to relay here. Líneas is over 4 feet high and Lacombe is over 5 feet wide. At the time Kelly and Otero painted these, both artists were expressing their desire to abandon easel painting as a means to realize a quote-unquote future art, as Kelly wrote, that, quote, must go on the wall itself, end quote. Earlier in 1950, Kelly wrote to his friend John Cage, I am not interested in paintings as it has been accepted for so long, to hang on the walls of houses as pictures. To hell with pictures. They should be the wall, or even better, on the outside wall of large buildings. Otero was similarly adamant, as we can hear in his conceptualization of the first international exhibition of abstract art. In a 1951 letter to Bulton, Otero explained, it should not be an abstract art salon or a simple exhibition. It needs to be something much more significant than that, an event of artistic magnitude that will exemplify the notion of unity among the arts, in the man and in the city. In other words, we are talking about an intimate collaboration among painting, architecture, sculpture, etc., in the interest of the life of the community. Integration held social significance for both Otero and Kelly in that it liberated art from the rarefied environment of the museum or the private home and brought it out into the public sphere. Otero and many of his fellow Venezuelan abstract artists believe that bringing abstraction onto the street or onto the facade of a building contributed to the process of modernization Venezuela was currently undergoing, giving the artists a way to participate in the social and cultural transformations taking place. For these socially minded artists, it also allowed for a degree of anonymity, suggesting a collective project that could break down barriers between the arts as well as between the artists themselves and between the artists and the general public. This idea evokes medieval artisan communities, an association that resonated for Kelly, who declared, I would like to be anonymous in the same way that the 12th century architects and designers of Romanesque churches were anonymous. Kelly acknowledged the political implications of bringing painting, quote, out into the viewer's world, end quote. But unlike Otero, he was not compelled to pursue social aspects of artistic integration. Now, the desire to unify the arts has been at the heart of many modernist projects, De Stijl and Bauhaus, for example. And across the Americas in the 1930s and 40s, public art and mural projects flourished through the efforts of artists associated with the Mexican mural Renaissance, Joaquim Torres Garcia, Natalia Torres Garcia, and the Federal Art Project of the Works Progress Administration. Post-war Paris witnessed a revival of muralism in public art as well. Fernand Léger argued for an abstract art that adapts itself to the wall and promoted interaction between artists and architects to determine colors of walls, an opinion shared by Le Corbusier, who maintained that modern architecture required color. The subject was discussed in various publications of the day that Otero and Kelly read, including Arte aujourd'hui, which printed essays such as the one you see that I have reproduced here, essays by authors including Michel Souffreux, who was very supportive of Kelly, as well as other publications like L'Observateur, which in 1951 published the article Architecture et Peinture by Charles Estienne, who was a very important advocate of abstract art. This atmosphere stimulated and encouraged Kelly and Otero's ambitions to say, the hell with pictures. But to work on walls presented many logistical issues, the least of which was securing opportunities to actually work on a building. Kelly and Otero did realize architectural projects, but before turning our attention to those, I would like to look first at examples of their work that immediately followed Líneas Inclinadas and Lacombe. And here we will see them expand the limitations of easel painting and attain a maturity of vision and concept. In 1951, Kelly created Colors for a Large Wall. As the title suggests, the work is huge. It's nearly 8 feet by 8 feet. Made up of 64 individual squares arranged across a grid, Colors for a Large Wall shows Kelly's ingenious solution of composing on a huge scale within the confines of his tiny studio by building the composition with portable square-foot panels that allowed him to easily transport the work. Colors for a Large Wall was based on a collage, which you see on the left, that Kelly made out of colored adhesive papers. Kelly was especially drawn to chance operations at this time. As he explains, the color distribution occurred very, very quickly without thinking. The randomness of the color squares produces a lively and disjointed rhythm in which the boldness of the colors transforms them into form itself. Similarly, chance and intuition were starting points for Otero's Color Rhythms, a series that would occupy him from 1955 to 1960. And I'm showing you at the center an example of one of Otero's study collages that I don't think is an actual study for the color ritmo on the right, but obviously has certain aesthetic affinities. Otero said, "No judgment or control apart from the unity of the act of creation itself." This is how Otero described his painted collage studies. And the final works that often measure over 6 feet high or horizontal, sometimes Otero would also orient the color ritmos horizontally, so at times they could stretch almost 6 feet across the wall. But looking at color ritmo number 1, for example, on the left, this is a work that reaches toward the ceiling and floor. Black stripes stretch from top to bottom of the plank, while a kaleidoscope of red, blue, green, purple, and black fragmented forms seem to shift and vibrate between the black verticals. Through their scale and color rhythm, Colors for a Large Wall and Color Ritmo animate and connect to architectural space. As Otero said about the colorismos, they spill over the plane, they accommodate them within the architectural space, they embrace it. We also see in these works a shift from their earlier paintings of the 1940s, whose facture is brushy and rough, to a harder edge style that has erased the hand of the artist. Coloritmo, for example, presents sharp edges and a smooth, flat surface, which Otero achieved by airbrushing Duco paint, a type of automotive lacquer. Kelly also achieved an industrial-like smooth surface through the painstaking application of multiple layers of paint. This, of course, stands in great contrast to the concurrent work of the abstract expressionists, whose hands and personality swirl across their canvases. Kelly and Otero's work, in contrast, suggests a degree of inscrutability that harks back to their desire for anonymity. Although Otero and Kelly developed their ideas for integration while in Paris, it was not until they returned home that they were able to realize such projects on a full scale. It was such allure that inspired Otero's return to Caracas in 1952. The architect Carlos Raúl Villanueva recruited Otero to work on the design of the campus of University City, which is one of the greatest integration projects that linked abstract art and architecture during the 1950s. Advocating artistic synthesis, Villanueva commissioned an array of international abstract artists, including Calder. You can see Calder's sound panels that he designed for the auditorium. Calder, Leger, Arp, Vasarely, and a number of younger Venezuelan abstract artists like Otero to create mosaics and sculpture to be integrated with the architecture. And you can see some examples of those in these images. But even before he began work on the university, Otero designed a group of aluminum and mosaic panels for the Jose and Angel Lamas Amphitheater in Caracas. The diagonal and undulating grids sprinkled with black and colored forms produce a sense of dynamism, as if the grids and forms were responding to music, suggesting yet another layer of artistic integration, as Gina McDaniel Tarver has suggested. And I'm showing you, obviously, on the left is the actual amphitheater, and on the right are just two examples of smaller gouache studies that Otero executed in preparation. Otero was able to evolve his ideas in the amphitheater through a number of projects at University City. It is in these projects that we actually see him achieving Kelly's pronouncement that painting should be the wall, even better, on the outside wall of large buildings. And for example, in this, Otero designed these mosaics, these blue, light blue and dark blue mosaics on the facade of the architectural faculty building, and down here we see, again, his mosaics for the engineering building. And this is an image of Otero himself right here, sitting inside the School of Engineering in front of his mosaics here as well. And, you know, you walk through the University City and there's just, it's just alive with these kinds of works throughout. In 1956, Kelly was commissioned to create a sculpture for the lobby of the Philadelphia Transportation Building in Penn Center, home to the Greyhound bus terminal. Kelly designed sculpture for a large wall, which you see here, for the narrow entrance lobby of the building above the elevators. And the work, which you see here in situ, and then here in the Matthew Marks Gallery, it's now, it's no longer in Philadelphia, it's now in MoMA's collection. The work is made up of 104 anodized aluminum panels. The arcing forms of the colored panels alternate with open spaces, creating a dynamic interplay between positive and negative space and color, light, and shadow. These irregular shapes, like fragments of color arranged with a linear framework, are comparable, I think, with Otero's coloritmos or his murals for the Lamas Amphitheater. There certainly is an aesthetic affinities here. In many ways, sculpture for a large wall and Otero's projects for University City and his coloritmos represent the culmination of Kelly and Otero's Paris work. Although each was to take his work in new directions over the course of their subsequent careers, Kelly was to develop his shaped canvas and the relationship between figure and ground, while Otero explored lyricism and kineticism. Both continue to make work that engages with the environment and plays with ideas of architectonics, as we can see in these two exterior sculpture projects. And I just wanted to point out, of course, in DC, we have, of course, Otero's Delta Solar, which is located just outside the National Air and Space Museum, so you can go see that in person. And just also very timely, this past week, there was an article in the New York Times talking about Ellsworth Kelly's new project for the Matthew Marks Gallery, in which he's designed the facade of a to-be-built gallery in California. And this facade is actually based on a study that Kelly executed in Paris, and then upon his return to the United States in the 60s, converted into a full painting, and now it's having yet a third life, if you will, becoming the facade of this building. So you start to see there's still kind of this continued interest in architecture and art connections. So in closing, I would like to return to this idea of unity in art that opened my talk. As we have seen, this idea on one level can speak to a literal synthesis of art forms that carry various levels of social and aesthetic meaning. But I would also like to end by returning to the other possible meanings of Otero's phrase, unity in art, that recognizes the possibilities for connection, not necessarily based on nationalistic lines, and one that stretches beyond unity with just between South and North American art, but speaks to a broader international context. And so, as we develop and evolve our models, as we're doing here at this conference, for examining the relationships between US and Latin American artists, I hope that we can ultimately expand these models, expand the reach of these models beyond these even nationalistic parameters that we're dealing with today, to even broader connections that can speak to the broad international unity that artists like Otero and Kelly actually lived and promoted. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Laura Roulet, an independent curator and writer specializing in contemporary and Latin American art. She has organized exhibitions in Puerto Rico at el Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico and in Washington, D.C. at the Art Museum of the Americas, the Mexican Cultural Institute, Edison Place Gallery, Hillier Art Space, Project 4, Fusebox, and the D.C. Art Center. Her publications include many catalog essays, encyclopedia entries, and articles in Art Journal, Sculpture, and the book Contemporary Puerto Rican Installation Art, the Guaguaria, the Trojan Horse, and the Termite. She worked on the Ana Mendieta retrospective, organized by the Hirshhorn Museum in 2004, and contributed to that catalog. Please welcome Laura.
I'd also like to thank the Amelia for her organizational genius, the Smithsonian, and the Terra Foundation. Much of my presentation today is based on research I did for the Ana Mendieta retrospective organized by curator Olga Vizo at the Hirshhorn. We interviewed dozens of Mendieta's family, friends, and colleagues. So I'm indebted to Olga, Raqueline Mendieta, the artist's sister, and also one of my fellow speakers today, Luis Camnitzer. His book, New Art of Cuba, remains a crucial resource for this period of Cuban art history. He jokes in his introduction that the critic Gerardo Mosquera should be writing the book. In writing this paper, Luis came up so often I felt like he should be giving this presentation, but apparently he has his own topic, so I thank him for his input. The work of Ana Mendieta encompasses the full range of avant-garde 1970s movements: conceptual, performance, earthwork, feminist, and identity art. Yet it is profoundly Cuban as well. Much of Mendieta's work involves negotiating and transcending boundaries, partly caused by geographic displacement, but also imposed by an art world that still categorized work by gender, ethnicity, media, first world versus third world, high or low art. This paper focuses on how she worked to personally connect people from North America and Cuba, as well as how her work draws aesthetically from both worlds. In his book, New Art of Cuba, Luis Camnitzer defines Spanglish art, or the amalgam of Latin and North American art, as representing the fact that one came from one place and went to another, and it functionally bridges the abyss left by that travel. In 1961, Mendieta was sent off the island of Cuba in an exodus of children known as Operation Pedro Pan. She and her sister Raqueline were placed in a series of foster homes in Iowa, an abrupt and radical displacement for a young girl who had just turned 13. They were not reunited with their mother and brother until 1966, and she would not see her father until 1979. As a student in the 1970s at the University of Iowa, Mendieta was already creating mature and performative conceptual work in an attempt to bridge the abyss left by that travel. Untitled, Death of a Chicken is Mendieta's only work to employ animal sacrifice. and the first to use blood as a symbolically potent material, both elements evoking her childhood impressions of Santeria, a syncretic Afro-Cuban religion practiced by the family's servants, not her Catholic parents. Though raised as a Catholic, Mendieta found aspects of Santeria, which she remembered as culturally pervasive in Cuba, to be a bridge reconnecting her with her former life. She also found the performative rituals of Santeria and use of materials such as blood, earth, water, and fire-igniting gunpowder to be a means of infusing spiritual power, or as she would put it, magic, into her art. Meanwhile, back in New York, welcome to the 70s. As Julia Bryant Wilson analyzes in her thoroughly researched study art workers' radical practice in the Vietnam War era, central art figures such as writer Lucy Lepard, minimalist sculptor Carl Andre, painters May Stevens and Rudolf Beranek, all pictured here, were not afraid to assert their political beliefs as intrinsic to artistic identity. Brian Wilson traces the creation of the Art Workers Coalition, AWC, in 1969, with its ambitious and far-reaching goals of redefining art as labor and mounting institutional critiques of exclusionary museum policies within the societal critiques of racism, sexism, and conduct of the Vietnam War. Lepard's commitment to feminism helped to assure that the feminist movement was not merely a footnote in this hub of activism, but an intrinsic strain. Lucy Lepard first met Mendieta when she was still a student in the intermediate program at the University of Iowa. Lepard was the first to write about Mendieta in the national media and to place her work in a feminist context. Writing in Ms. magazine in October 1975, Lepard mentions one of Mendieta's rape tableaux. In the May 1976 issue of Art in America, she includes an image of Mendieta's work in the article The Pains and Pleasures of Rebirth, Women's Body Art. While Mendieta was active in feminist art circles, she exhibited with the Women's Collective AIR Gallery from 1978 to 1982 and contributed to Heresy's Journal. She later grew leery of being pigeonholed as a feminist or merely as a Latina artist. Carl Andre was one of the founders and key leaders of the AWC, characterized by Lepard as our resident Marxist, and one of the very few AWC members who'd actually read Marx. He was famously attired in workman's coveralls and a highly visible member of the demonstrations in the 1970s. So you would think that these people, all with socially engaged art practices, some self-avowed Marxists, would be interested in visiting Cuba when travel restrictions eased up under the Carter administration. And they were. Mendieta was first able to return to her homeland in January 1980 as a member of the Círculo de Cultura Cubana, the Cuban Cultural Circle, returning first out of a sense of emotional longing to reconnect with her family and birthplace. She quickly developed ties within the art community. Between January 1980 and July 1983, she traveled 7 times to the island, sometimes as a tour guide for the Cuban Cultural Circle, sometimes to exhibit and create work on her own. These works on the beaches of Florida and Cuba express her need for reunion with the island, spanning the straits of the ocean, and experimenting with ideas that she would later develop in her Rupestrian series of carvings. Not only did she lead tours, she recruited for them. New Yorkers like the poet Jane Cortez, artist Mel Edwards, and curator Lowry Sims remember Mendieta urging them to visit Cuba. Though Sims never coincided on any of Mendieta's trips, she was grateful for the literature on Wilfredo Lam brought back by Mendieta, knowing of Sims' research interests in his work. Rudolf Beranek published an account of the tour led by Mendieta that he, May Stevens, Lepard, Andre, Edwards, Cortez, and others took to Cuba in the spring of 1982. He writes in Art Forum that the group was interested in the relationship between ideology and art in Cuba. They met with the writer and curator Gerardo Mosquera, and he, as he would do for many a foreign visitor, provided an officially sanctioned, yet critically informed interpretation of the contemporary scene. He stated, "Cuba is part of the Western cultural tradition. All the modes of contemporary artistic expression inform young Cuban art, though sometimes at a delayed pace." When questioned about Castro's famous "within the revolution everything, outside the revolution nothing" pronouncement, Mosquera suavely replied, Young Cuban artists are for the revolution, instinctively, intuitively, as one is for life. The group would learn this acceptance did not really hold true for all of the new generation of artists they were about to meet. Mendieta's second trip to Cuba in January 1981 coincided with the Volumen Uno, Volume 1 exhibit, featuring the work of what would become known as La Generación de los 80, the 1980s generation. The first generation raised under the Castro regime, these artists broke with the programmatic art promoted by the government in the 1970s. Mendieta befriended Jose Bedia, Juan Elso Padilla, Ricardo Rodriguez Bray, Flavio Garciandia, Gustavo Perez Monzon. Several of these artists, including Bedia, Rodriguez Bray, and Elso Padilla, shared an interest in Santeria, Palomonte, and pre-Columbian culture. Like Mendieta, they were incorporating rituals, materials, and imagery from these sources into their own art. Bedia remembers Mendieta as being part of the first rapprochement between Anglo and Latin American artists, describing her as a connector. In writing of Mendieta's legacy on the island, Cuban curator Elvis Fuentes, now at El Museo del Barrio in New York, declares her ability to appropriate and synthesize aspects of land art, body art, and feminism turned her into a kind of compendium of the various experimental trends of the period. Hence, when she visited Cuba, Mendieta became a catalyst for young creators who were eager to try out new means of expression. Mendieta had successfully synthesized many Euro-North American movements into her art. However, I tend to agree more with Luis Camnitzer's measured assessment of her impact on the Volumen Uno generation, when he writes, Ana became the ideal mediator between the 1980s generation and the outside. She did not influence artists aesthetically, but provided a sounding board for ideas and gave moral support. She also became a two-way carrier of information about art between Cuba and the United States. Though the Cuban artists were familiar with the latest developments in Euro-North American art through the art magazines they managed to acquire, they report that Mendieta was an important interpreter. She brought magazines and books such as the Whitney Museum catalog, 200 Years of American Sculpture, which focus on artists such as Robert Smithson, Donald Judd, Richard Serra, and Carl Andre. She was, in fact, romantically involved with Carl Andre, and on his first visit to the island in 1981, she arranged for Bedia and friends to dine with him. They were impressed with his elegant manners, but somewhat incredulous over Andre's purported Marxist beliefs, grumbling that they had to live inside La Teoria. As Mendieta later summarized Mendieta's significance for them, we were already formed as artists, but she gave us a look at the broad art world through the eyes of a Cuban, like us. They argued about minimalism. They agreed on admiration for Richard Long. In short, she demystified the North American art world. In return, they shared their greater knowledge of the Taínos and Santeria. They also helped her to scout out a location for the Rupestrian sculptures. Mendieta was the first post-revolution Cuban-American artist to receive permission from the Cuban Ministry of Culture to exhibit and create work on the island. Aided by funding from a Guggenheim Foundation fellowship, Mendieta returned in 1981, July, to create the Rupestrian sculptures in the Escaleras de Jaruco. Located in Jaruco Park, about 20 miles from Havana. Choosing two sites in the mountainside, she carved a series of goddess sculptures into the soft, oolitic limestone grottos. The creation myths of the Taínos, an indigenous tribe of the Caribbean, and other pre-Columbian Mesoamerican people center on caves as the birthplace of humanity. Inspired by petroglyphs, she used the natural rock outcroppings to carve the outlines of the figures, which were scaled to her petite, under 5-foot height. Sculptural volumes replaced the voids of her silhouette forms, perhaps reflecting a sense of psychological restoration felt by the artist in returning her work to Cuba. Having researched the Taíno people, she saw herself as a cultural inheritor, identifying with their dislocation and near decimation within a generation of the Spanish conquest. Based on consultation with Yale University professor Jose Juan Arom, and the writings of Cuban scholar Lydia Cabrera, Mendieta named the carvings after Taíno goddesses: Maroya, goddess of the moon; Quabanasek, goddess of the wind; Eyare, mother; Guanaroca, first woman; Albaboa, Beautiful One, Bakuya, Light of Day, Guacar, First Menstruation, Atabe, Mother of the Waters, and Itiba, Kahubaba, Old Mother Blood. Aware that few spectators would ever encounter the works in person, Mendieta documented the series in black and white photographs, 35mm slides, and Super 8 film. She later printed and exhibited the series in large format, 40 by 60-inch prints to convey the experience of seeing the works life-size. She also received a grant from the New York State Council on the Arts to create photo etchings of the series, which she intended to print in book format with an introduction by Professor Aron. To achieve a sense of intimacy, Mendieta cropped the photo so that each sculpture appears independently. The initial 5 sets of 10 photo etchings were prepared on zinc plates and printed by artist Luis Camnitzer in 1983. Although she intended to print an edition of 20, the project remained unfinished at her death in 1985 and was completed posthumously by Liliana Porter. Mendieta advocated for the intercultural exchange of artists to run both ways. Knowing that Camnitzer taught at SUNY Old Westbury, she urged him to arrange residencies for artists Jose Bedia, Flavio Garciandia, and Ricardo Rodriguez Bray. In a cosmic alignment of the stars, State Department, Cuban Ministry of Culture, and Ford Foundation, it happened. The 3 traveled to New York in the spring of 1985. Again, Lucy Lepard acted as promoter, writing about their exhibit in Art in America, asserting that the Cubanía, true Cuban character of their art, is hard for North Americans to recognize. She writes that it has its sources in the revolution's emphasis on national identity and on the quality of everyday life, on historical research, cultural and political analysis, and a sheer pleasure and place, now encompassing outdoor art, for which she gives credit to Mendieta for influencing their expansion into nature. The exhibit toured the US, helping to launch the 3 artists' careers abroad. In the 1980s, for economic, personal, and political reasons, all 3 left Cuba to live in the US, Mexico, and Belgium, respectively. Though still friendly with the group of Cuban artists, Mendieta's last trip had been in 1983. Having received a Prix de Rome, Mendieta moved to Italy, which is where she and Andre married in January 1985. Duetto Pietri Foli, Duet of Stone and Leaf, a book of lithographs created jointly, serves as an example of the aesthetic convergence between Mendieta and Andre, and how Mendieta assimilated what she desired from both North and Latin American sources to serve her own expressive needs. This collaboration rather perfectly exemplifies their creative synergy and divergence. Meant as a duet of complementary forms, both artists used organic materials to compose compositions that are spare and reductive, without overlapping or extraneous elements. Printed by Romolo and Rosalba Bula in an edition of 40, the exquisitely crafted 20-page volume alternates 10 pages designed by each artist. They are separate but equal. Andre used square, unevenly shaped paving stones to create variations on closely grouped patterns forming a large rectangle. The geometric, mathematical basis of his aesthetic is clearly evident, as is the biomorphic root of hers. Mendieta arranged a variety of oval leaves on a zinc plate. In her last conversation with artist friend May Stevens, Mendieta confided that she had found her shape, and it was a leaf. Her artistic expression had evolved in the 70s from performances and earth body works using her own body to earthworks scaled by her body. In the 1980s, her embodiment shifts from the goddess sculptures to the truncated, fragile form of a leaf. While Andre allows a slight instability and irregularity to creep into his composition of the stones, Mendieta's leaf lithographs are her most simple, structured forms. As an example of Mendieta's lasting inspiration for contemporary Cuban art, Tania Bruguera initiated a series of recreations of Mendieta's performances in 1988. Concerned about retaining the memory of Mendieta's legacy on the island, Bruguera began reenacting her works using documentation from the catalog for Mendieta's first retrospective held at the New Museum in New York in 1987. She explains, "For me, Ana Mendieta not only became a bridge between people leaving the island and those who stayed, but she was also a role model for artists on the island who wanted to do Cuban as well as international art. Today, her work is an integral part of the discourse of Cuban art history and an inspiration for many young artists, which began as a personal and spiritual journey through her work, became a cultural responsibility, and later on, a political gesture. Bruguera goes on to say, amazingly, what was at the time a radical attitude is now the official line. Cuba, in recent years, embarked on a campaign of reclamation, recognition, and reconciliation with Cuban artists living abroad. The artist-run collective Galeria Dupe also has worked to recuperate Mendieta's history on the island. Run by René Francisco, who is part of a younger generation of artists who studied with Flavio Garciandia at the ISA, Instituto Superior de Arte, and now teaches there himself, Galeria Dupe made a pilgrimage to Jaruco in 1997 to discover what remained of Mendieta's Rupestrian sculptures. Though overgrown, several are still visible. The artists of Galeria Dupe periodically make temporary silhouettes to conjure Mendieta's memory and spirit, a fitting tribute for an artist who longed to bring her work home. Thank you.
It's working. Our next speaker, Sarah Montross, is a doctoral candidate at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. She is working on a dissertation concerned with experimental forms of film, video, and television by Latin American artists living in New York City from the 1970s to the 1990s. She has assisted art history courses at NYU and Hunter College and has held positions and internships at the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of the City of New York, and the National Gallery of Art. Please welcome Sarah Montross.
Thank you, and thank you, Amelia and Dr. Ramos and the Terra Foundation and the Smithsonian for this wonderful conference. It's been very illuminating so far. Chilean artist Juan Downey staged a performance titled Invisible Energy Dictates a Dance Concert on August 11, 1979, just outside the Museum of History and Technology, today known as the National Museum of American History, blocks from where we are seated. For the event, Downey placed measuring devices, including a Geiger counter, seismometer, and a seismometer at 5 other Smithsonian buildings. Oscillators converted and recorded the sounds, air, and radio waves into electronic strands. Dancers then performed according to the particular electronic voice they were assigned, and their movements were then taped and projected for a larger audience gathered near the Washington Mall. This collective event took place in the days leading up to some of the largest peace demonstrations against the Vietnam War on the Mall as well. In this related drawing collage, we see at the upper left a map where Downey has circled the Smithsonian institutions among the very archives of American culture, history, and technology as sites for sonic and electronic measurement. In essence, Downey proposed to convert this physical architecture, represented as a top-down orthogonal map, into a spontaneous electronic concert. This performance is an apt preface to my paper's analysis of select video installations of Downey's later epic project, Video Transamerica's, that spans from 1973 to 1977. As we shall see, these installations were similarly based on principles of a performative remapping, albeit on a much grander scale, that of the Americas, and with the use of the video camera. Recent scholarship, including in particular texts by Julieta Gonzalez and Nicolas Guagnini, has incorporated Video Transamerica's into a lineage of inter-American travelogues by explorers, anti-colonialist revolutionaries, and anthropologists, such as Alexander Humboldt, Simón Bolívar, and Claude Lévi-Strauss. These writings have also analyzed how Downey critically engaged with the ethnographic canon. The efforts led by Valerie Smith and Marylise Downey in creating the current traveling exhibition, Juan Downey, the Invisible Architect, also offers invaluable new scholarship on all aspects of Downey's career. In particular, the exhibition's focus on Downey's conception of invisible architecture, defined as a utopian drive towards a society constructed not of physical architecture, but out of forms of electronic communication in sync with the organic world, has particular bearing on my presentation. This exhibition, currently on view at Arizona State University Art Museum, and which will be coming to the Bronx Museum of Art later this year in the spring, includes the best-known installation of Video Transaméricas, which I'm showing here in other recent displays on the left. This arrangement is based on a version created at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston and Long Beach Museum of Art in 1976, in which Downey laid an outlined map of the Americas across the museum floor, showing his single and double channel videos at the relative locations Downey had filmed them. This allows viewers to conceptually travel the Americas and draw associations between their omnipresent position and Downey's local and intimate impressions of the American landscapes and peoples. My aim here is to analyze some of the lesser discussed configurations of Video Transaméricas, in which Downey merged forms of mapping with his concept of a dematerialized architecture, often informed by pre-Columbian cultures. I want to stress the ways in which aspects of exhibition and transmission significantly affected and informed how one experienced Downey's video travelogues, and following this, we can better judge the reception of these works. In particular, I will analyze exhibition records from two museum venues, the Everson Museum in Syracuse, New York, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. Both museums are crucial sites in the early history of video art, as they were among the first to exhibit and collect the medium in the early 1970s. At this time, video art installation was new artistic terrain, just entering the museum space, and was quite unlike the large-scale multimedia spectacles that are now standard practice in modern contemporary art museums. While certainly linked to histories of the moving image, at this time, video art generally lacked both standard methods for exhibition and a critical apparatus, which artists like Downey saw as a tremendous opportunity to build original forms of display. More specifically, these experimentations coincided with the growth of interdisciplinary visual studies, and in Downey's installations, we have an exemplary case of this coalescence of avant-garde performance and ethnographic documentary. Even before embarking on his inter-American journeys, Downey was well-traveled. He trained as an architect in Chile before moving to Europe in the early 1960s, becoming engaged with artistic circles in Madrid and Paris, including Stanley Hayter's Atelier. After moving to Washington, D.C. in 1965, Downey began envisioning his Video Transaméricas project, yet it was not until the early 1970s, after transplanting again to New York City, that the artist, with his wife Marily's stepson and select artist friends, embarked on a series of extended journeys throughout the Americas. Downey announced this collective expedition on the cover and in the pages of the video journal Radical Software, and soon after embarked on the first months of travels, driving across the United States, down into Mexico and Guatemala, and in subsequent trips journeying through Peru, Bolivia, and Downey's native country. During the second and often considered climactic portion of Video Transaméricas, Downey, his wife, and stepdaughter lived among two indigenous communities, the Guajibos and the Yanomami, within Venezuela's Federal Reserve of the Amazon during two extended stays between 1976 and 1977. Downey's sojourns were in keeping with those by fellow alternative media collectives such as Ant Farm and their Media Bus. Inspired by road trip counterculture, Native American ritualistic practices, and media ecology promoted by theorists such as Gregory Bateson, Downey and his fellow cybernetic nomads envisioned their travels as mind-altering experiences, albeit imbued with a social purpose. With a Sony Portapak video camera, Downey traced his movements throughout Central and South American urban areas, small villages, and pre-Columbian sites, always with an eye towards vernacular architectural forms, whether monumental or humble. This connection between video and architecture is particularly significant as Downey understood both to be forms of mass communication due to their public and visual nature, as well as their symbolic meanings shared and read by large audiences. Along his travels, Downey would videotape inhabitants and share his camera, allowing local peoples to tape one another. Downey would then screen these encounters to subsequent communities he visited. He would also include footage from New York City, weaving urban North American culture into this process of hemispheric integration. In this way, he aimed to connect all American peoples and inform them of shared traditions, myths, and diverse living conditions by way of the newly developed video technology that put the power of broadcasting in the hands of lay people. At a fundamental level, Downey understood the video camera as an idealistic political tool. He stated, just the attitude of going around with a porta-pack, taping their viewpoint is political activity, to show a reality that is considered inferior, savage, and show it as superior. The idea of creating a horizontal network of information among the Indians, although the scale is so small, is so minimal because I do it by hand. Downey's political commitments were further altered following the first month of his travels when on September 11, 1973, Allende's socialist government was toppled in a violent coup led by General Pinochet. His identity then abruptly shifted from expatriate to exile, and his subsequent writings and videos are imbued with a critical nostalgia for a homeland that in many respects no longer existed. Downey created many finely edited videos out of these restless travels. The horizontal approach that he described in political terms extended to his videographic aesthetic. Many scenes are low-level scanning, a gathering of information across the landscape, local markets, musical performances, and architectural forms, accompanied by the artist's lyrical meditations on the cultural ecologies of the societies he encountered and his introspective self-explorations. A number of these were two-channel pieces, which would form a bicameral viewing of two cultures, two locations, or even two different phenomenological experiences of the same site. Downey displayed these tapes in many contexts, from cable television programs to video festivals, most often amid the thriving alternative art scene of downtown Manhattan. But among the most compelling contexts of display were their incorporation into live performances in complex multi-monitor installations. In one early example at the Kitchen in 1974, Downey screened footage from the Nazca lines while performing amid pieces of coal arranged in the shape of a desert line drawing. Fellow dancers Carmen Bouchot and Suzanne Harris crossed the floor, leaving a trail of white chalk, a metaphor for the Pan-American highway that cut through the desert and aimed to unify both continents under the presumed promotion of increased trade. Downey's collapsing of ancient archaeology and contemporary engineering preceded Robert Morris's well-known art form article aligned with Nazca. Despite this shared fascination, the artist used the ancient lines to unique ends. In his text, Morris called the Nazca lines large-scale public art, essentially adopting the site to analyze an emerging body of post-minimalist art from the 1970s, which was increasingly private and inwardly focused. In contrast, Downey's Nazca performance was less a way to engage with contemporary artist activities in New York, but one piece of a much larger program of encounter, absorption, and construction of a network of indigenous American cultures, past and present. 2 months later, Downey presented his Video Transamerica's debriefing pyramid at the Everson Museum, arranging monitors in an octahedron in the proportions of the Cheops pyramid that screened footage from his visits to 4 pyramids in Mexico and Guatemala in an interesting sort of layering of both Egyptian and pre-Columbian ancient architecture. Carmen Bouchot danced on the stage while Downey simultaneously performed and videotaped around her. This was set against the compelling atrium space of the newly built I. M. Pei designed museum. The Everson was Pei's first foray into museum architecture and represented a wholly new approach to a museum as a site for artistic happenings as much as a repository for art collections. Elsewhere in the museum at this time was Ira Schneider's Manhattan is an Island, which consisted of monitors constructed in the shape of the city at various heights to express the area's topography. Both installations, despite their differing references to pre-Columbian or modern architecture, express compressed and highly mediated spatial experiences. These pieces occurred during a conference organized by young video curator David Ross, titled Video and the Museum, which is one of the earliest gatherings of artists and professionals to discuss the potential uses of video within museums. Soon after, Ross proposed that museums themselves ought to have their own television channel as a way of expanding beyond the physical confines of the museum, thus linking and educating local communities, an idea that he credits in part to Juan's conception of video as an architectural element. As Ross stated to me, in fact, I was using all of the vocabulary of Juan's, of building invisible architectural systems, and that's why Juan was very important to my thinking, where you could create a community where you had an architecture based on an economics of abundance as opposed to an economics of scarcity. Rather than of steel and real estate and how much money it costs to build buildings, you would build informational architecture. We thought it was boundless, and in fact it is. It wasn't really limitless until we got to the internet, but we kind of sensed it was limitless. Throughout this period and into the 1980s, Downey used maps as malleable metaphors to make statements about politically imposed boundaries, territoriality, and other notions of power and projection, as seen in his Map of Chile from 1975, presented and ultimately censored at the Center for Inter-American Relations, which critically confronted the United States' relationship to Chile's mining industry. The artist also crafted many exquisite large-scale maps depicting the Americas as transforming landmasses, like tectonic plates suggesting the passage from a primordial era to a contemporary geography of national boundaries, overlaid or unified by electronic currents and routes of travel. Yet in contrast to a geographic map, Downey's installation at the Whitney Museum was structured along cardinal directions. While a geographic map connotes a westernized or even militaristic overlay, cardinal direction is less a system of mapping than a method of orientation that can be used to find oneself anywhere. Disparate American cultures were screened simultaneously, no longer organized by location, such that Video Transamerica's becomes less a journey with identifiable points of arrival or departure, and is rather an inhabitable architectural space of display, projection, and live capture. A film of the Latin American landscape was projected from the ceiling to a central square on the floor, creating a pyramid of light the visitors could enter and virtually inhabit the changing American landscape, while their actions were taped from above and displayed live. Ideally, North American urbanites became aware of their own integration within these videos, producing a coming into consciousness of one's own place and performance amid these shifting views. It was not a single tape, but rather all of them playing simultaneously that produced a gestalt, which one critic understood as an attempt to reorient an attitude of willful ignorance that had persisted since Columbus's landing, an attitude, she wrote, which has robbed us of a wealth of knowledge about the original inhabitants of what is now our hemisphere. Woven within these myriad scenes of local culture, Downey conveyed deeply felt personal and political concerns, particularly in his video In the Beginning, a biting and at times humorous critique of the Chilean upper class and their complicity with the coup, performed by a theater troupe that was imprisoned soon after. At the end, Downey implored the audience to write to General Pinochet to demand freedom of all art for all artists and intellectuals. This tape was an explicit charge for the North American gallery visitors to assist their South American artistic counterparts, and a warning that the performance itself could be a transgressive and punishable offense in Downey's native country. The timing of the Whitney show was particularly poignant for Downey. Prior to its preparation, the artist had been living and filming among the Guajibo community in Venezuela for 2 months. Soon after returning to New York City to prepare his Whitney show, the artist traveled back to Venezuela and embarked on his most extensive period of field work among the Yanomami Indians. Surprisingly, Downey kept in correspondence with the Whitney staff, even within the Amazon region, sending this postcard, which reads on the back, "Dear Mark, thank you for your letter. Work is turning out beautiful. They love my videotapes here. As you can appreciate on the card, things are pretty wild, to say the least. My head is ripening consistently. Along his travels, Downey had linked societal inequities he encountered to the destructive legacies of colonialism, but this view increased as he encountered exploitative missionary work in the Amazon region in his later travels. What began as an idealistic journey of self-discovery and engagement would, in these last months of travel, develop into a deeper engagement with anthropological theory. During this time, the artist would come to critically engage with the difficulties and psychosocial motivations of the Western ethnographic project of knowing the self through objectification and possession of the other. Thus, the Whitney show becomes a threshold point between Downey's building up of this complex network of inter-American exchange and the subsequent critical analysis of his own motivations to do so. This exhibition also marked a significant juncture at the Whitney Museum. As the press release indicates, it was the first time that the museum's pioneering film and video department, led by curator John Hanhart, used video and film in a way that went beyond single monitor or single screen formats. Downey's show was in fact to be the first in a series of these new multimedia exhibitions. In addition to this prominent placement, Downey would be included in at least 5 other Whitney biennials, an additional solo show, and numerous group exhibitions. Hanhart's sustained support of the artist, as well as his embrace of diverse moving image practices, leads us to consider compelling interdisciplinary intersections within the museum space itself, specifically between Downey's video installations and ethnographic documentary. Just months before Downey's own exhibition, the film and video series hosted the New York premiere of several films on the Yanomami tribe that Downey was then preparing to visit. One film in particular, The Axe Fight, by filmmaker Timothy Ash and anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon, broke down the elements of a conflict among Yanomami tribe members, repeatedly showing the actions of the fight several times over to reveal the different ways in which one could interpret the same event. It was primarily used to teach anthropology students to critically analyze ethnographic film rather than accept it as objective truth. Yet in the context of the Whitney Museum, one could argue that it crossed over into the realm of structuralist filmmaking as it deconstructed the processes of its own making. Downey's subsequent videos, based on his own habitation among the members of the Yanomami community, would go further into this form of fracturing, particularly the way in which the artist mixed anthropological analysis of indigenous culture and his own subjective experiences. These later videos share broader developments in the discipline of visual anthropology, as ethnographers in the field were increasingly putting the camera in the hands of their native subject, while theorists further questioned ethnographic authority and historic interrelations of ethnography and avant-garde art. Yet the Whitney exhibition already contained these overlaps, as fellow video practitioner Davidson Gigliotti noted in a review, stating of Downey's installation that the tapes at first suggest the work of an archaeologist or anthropologist, making tapes for later study in some classroom or laboratory. As we watch, however, it is soon apparent that the treatment and organization of these images are the one who pursues a different sort of knowledge, organized on a much more subjective basis. Despite clear differences of intent, I'd like to suggest that Downey's installation, Ash's films at the Whitney, share further significance. In both cases, is the structure of how one frames these representations of other cultures, whether it is by maps, cardinal orientation, or alterations in film editing that shape their meaning. Moreover, both are effects of a highly mediated world in which a vast influx of knowledge, even that from among some of the most remote or so-called primitive cultures, was now primarily filtered through moving images distributed by broadcast TV, cable, and film. While Downey would continue to create smaller installations using select videos from Video Transamerica's, the Whitney exhibition was his last comprehensive and probably most visible display of the series during his lifetime. His installation follows complex guidelines of construction in which video, or equally the people and cultures displayed, become architectural elements that surrounded and interacted with the performers and gallery visitors. In these works, Downey proposed a radical displacement, transplanting his personal visual archive of South and Central indigenous cultures and landscape onto North American performance spaces, galleries, and museums. This remapping of the Americas has highly personal motivations, as the artist attempted to recuperate his roots, as he put it, through a process of continual exploration and encounter. As we have seen, Video Transamerica's also dialogued with, or to some extent influenced efforts at the Everson and the Whitney to become more permeable, both in conceiving of new ways to link local communities outside the museum walls, but also by integrating new territories of moving image practice. Thank you.
Our last speaker in this session is Karen Mary Davalos, Chair and Associate Professor of Chicana and Chicano Studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. She is the author of Exhibiting Mestizaje, Mexican-American Museums in the Diaspora, and the Mexican Museum of San Francisco Papers, 1971 to 2006. Davalos' critically acclaimed book, Yolanda M. Lopez, published in 2008, brings together her research interests in Chicana feminist scholarship, spirituality, art, exhibition practices, and oral history. She is currently finishing another book entitled Chicana Chicano Art, Improbable Subjects and Political Gestures. A forthcoming chapter on the Goes Art Studios and Gallery will appear in LA Chicano, the concurrent exhibitions catalog about Chicano art between 1945 and 1980. Please welcome Dr. Davalos.
Good morning. I know I'm between you and lunch. I want to thank the conveners. It's always important to have people who can organize us from disparate places to come together to talk about shared concepts and to argue about interesting new possibilities. I want to thank funders, and I want to thank hosts, because without these, we wouldn't be able to have these interesting debates. Chicano art is typically presented as a regional, parochial, or derivative style, rather than as an international art form with aesthetic links to Latin America or Europe. Some of this erroneous or narrow understanding of Chicano art comes from the misperception that Chicano artists are predetermined by their cultural heritage. The accepted reference for Chicano art are vernacular barrio aesthetics, Catholic iconography, and the Chicano movement, the crusade for social and civil rights between the late 1960s and 1970s. Similarly, Mexican influences are presumably so clearly demarcated that one need only consider the presence of pre-Columbian motifs and allusions to Mexican muralism in Chicano art. Chicano artists are simply seen as echoing Mexican muralists who denounced easel painting as bourgeois and apolitical and championed art for the people. The specific aesthetic dialogue and exchange between Mexican and Chicano artists is still largely unexplored. In addition, a nationalist methodology undergirds art criticism. US and Latin American art history cannot account for the dispersal and migration of Mexican heritage peoples across geopolitical borders. Chicano artists are generally omitted from both fields. A cosmopolitan understanding of Chicano artists and their work is only recently emerging. My investigation of Chicano artists' travels in Mexico and elsewhere uncovers a postmodern hybridity. This work engages with, rather than ignores, the contested, appropriated, and negotiated qualities of Chicano art as different artists are drawn into specific Mexican aesthetics, techniques, and styles, which they then apply in new contexts in the Los Angeles setting. This approach ultimately suggests a complementary formulation of Mexican, American, Chicano, Latin American, and European art, and pulls all of these sites into the center of art historical analysis. My presentation investigates 3 Los Angeles Chicano artists, Judy Baca. I thought I would just press, but now it's not there. Note. There we go. Wrong button. Chicano artists Judy Baca, David Boteo, and Margaret Garcia. I analyze how their travels to Mexico transformed their artistic production upon returning to their Los Angeles studios. Although European influence is often the privileged transnational narrative of art history, it's completely ignored in Chicano art studies, even in the Smithsonian Latino art history interviews. And therefore, I also take into account Boteo's European tour as it preceded and equally informed his artistic production in Los Angeles. Baca and Garcia further complicate a narrow understanding of Chicano art by participating in the transnational flows of art from Mexico to Los Angeles. Furthermore, each artist demonstrates a different mode of artistic exchange across the US-Mexico border. I start with Judy Baca, whose work illustrates the most direct mode of influence and that we can clearly see a before and after results of her trip to Mexico. Baca brought from Mexico the compositional technique for mural design formulated by David Alfaro Siqueiros. While Baca imports Siqueiros' compositional formula, David Boteo was influenced by indigenous revivalism in Mexican modernist art and architecture. He appropriated its style and content for Chicano empowerment and solidarity in East Los Angeles. Margaret Garcia illustrates another mode of aesthetic influence, notably because she took up painting after her second family vacation in Mexico. Her experience requires us to acknowledge new paths of exchange since Chicano artists were introduced to Mexican ones in the commercial galleries in Los Angeles. Judith Baca was born in Southern California and came of age during the height of the Chicano movement. Compelled by the disconnected and neglected teenagers she was teaching at Bishop Alemany High School, she developed a pedagogy that would become her signature approach for creating large public works of art with at-risk youth from rival gang territories. In 1976, Baca co-founded Social and Public Art Resource Center, SPARC, and refined her pedagogy, which tied image making to community making by identifying shared experiences to build trust and respect. In the summers of 1976, 1977, 1980, and 1981 and 83, she led teams of youth into one of Los Angeles's cement river basins, the Tujunga Wash, to paint the Great Wall of Los Angeles. Unlike the mural movement in Mexico, which was supported by a successful revolutionary government, Chicano murals came out of the people themselves against the status quo. Instead of well-funded projects in government buildings, Chicano murals were located where people lived and financed by community organizations and donations, as well as social welfare initiatives, correctional facilities, employment training programs, and other municipal offices that aim to rehabilitate poor, undereducated, and working-class residents. These slides document the first 1,000 feet of the mural. Painted in 1976, the first installation of the Great Wall documents Los Angeles prehistory to the 1910s. For each section, an artist managed a team of youth, but Baca longed for fuller collaborative styles that would unite the mural makers and the overall image. In 1977, she made her second trip to Mexico and attended Taller Siqueiros at the Poly Forum, and it provided her with the visual language to achieve a more coherent design and inspired a strategy to achieve the level of collaboration she desired. Studying under Luis Arenal at the Taller Siqueiros, Baca learned of Siqueiros' polyangular perspective, an approach to painting that accommodates the moving viewer and applies perspective from several points of view in order to articulate conceptions of space and time. This was a scientific relationship that captured the attention of Siqueiros and other modernists. Baca imported polyangular perspective for use at the Great Wall of Los Angeles and one of many other murals that carry her signature and the signature of SPARC. As you can see, the polyangular perspective completely transformed her approach to the Great Wall. The first 1,000 feet is basically designed as if the viewer is standing directly in front of the image, using the conventions of seeing developed for viewing paintings in a gallery. This convention made for abrupt transitions and a very flat perspective. But each summer after 1977, the Great Wall becomes more dynamic, integrated, and fluid. The Taller Siqueiros was pivotal in creating, as Baca states in her own words, an artwork that's musical in composition. Although polyangular perspective does not determine the process of mural making, Baca found that it supported deeper collaborations. I quote, "I really started to understand. I could add the element of the power that comes out of designing the composition. I joined the power of the process with the power of the image. I wasn't asking people, what do you want to see on a wall? I asked them much more. What do you care about? What's happening? And then from that, I could draw on things that they understand." The Taller provided Baca with a technique that joins space and time through harmonious compositions that accommodates the viewer as a moving witness to art and history. But Baca did not simply copy Siqueiros' technique in the design of the Great Wall. She blended it with a process that would transform individual participants into collaborators who learned to work and live in solidarity. David Boteo is one of the most important muralists in the city, and his experience serves as a powerful reason for revising Chicano art criticism. Boteo is best known for the mural collective Los Dos Streetscapers, which he formed with Wayne Healy in 1975, and which the pair later renamed East Los Streetscapers as new members joined them in 1980. His murals, both those produced independently or with Healy, are considered emblematic of Chicano indigenous aesthetics and Chicano futurism. Relatively unknown is Boteo's contribution to the first Chicano commercial gallery in Los Angeles, Goes Art Studios and Gallery, which he co-founded with two brothers, Juan and Jose Gonzalez. Although this conference addresses the exchange between Latin America and the United States, allow me a detour, because Boteo did not consider art as a profession until his grand tour of Europe. Here's what happened. Upon graduation from Salesian High School, Boteo enrolled in several art classes at California State University, Los Angeles. There he received excellent grades in studio art, but left college after 1 year because he was distracted by a fundamental question: what is my purpose in life? My only thing, he says, was art. It was really valuable to me, but I was thinking I'm going to have to start a family, and once that's going to happen, you've got to have a career. So I dropped out. Without college deferment to protect him, Boteo was drafted in 1966 and deployed to Germany. While stationed in Europe, Boteo was amazed by the accessibility of art from the streets of Germany, France, Spain, and Italy, the 4 countries that he toured. The monuments, public art, and historic sites sort of opened a window up for me, he says. I went into the service and I saw all this history of Europe, and I realized the value of being an artist. I saw the value of history and public art, and I wanted the same for Los Angeles. When discharged from the military, he immediately joined with Juan and his brother Jose to open Goes Art Studios and Gallery, and they initiated a massive urban development project to create an alternative architectural plan for East Los Angeles. Similar to his murals, the architectural innovations that Boteo rendered emphasized indigenous revivalism. In this way, the work evidences the modernist impulse to lift meaning from its spatial and temporal context, but it also employs Renaissance humanism's desire to trace past achievements as cultural legacies of the present and the future. Created after Boteo and Gonzalez took a 2-week trip to Mexico City in September 1970, this drawing shows the indigenous motifs found in early Chicano public art. This massive pyramid water-shaped fountain of 3 or 4 tiers, the grand stairways that flanked either side of the fountain, and the scaled version of the Pyramid of the Sun, the original source of the water, was perched above the community. Each level of the fountain held a sculptural reference to pre-Columbian civilizations, as in this Aztec calendar, and an image of Cuauhtemoc, the last emperor, the Mexica who resisted Spanish conquistadors. The stairway was designed like a serpent's body and included 8 images of the heads of Quetzalcoatl as depicted at Tenochtitlan, the capital city of the Aztec Empire. But unlike the monuments in Mexico, this proposed site was not intended to support a national identity. The integrated urban plan countered the social and physical displacement that Chicanos experienced with the construction of Los Angeles freeway systems, as well as the earlier deterritorialization of Mexicans with the annexation of Mexico's northern frontier in 1848. The alternative monument was a visual challenge to the assimilationist discourse and manifest destiny that they were learning in the schools. The architectural design was to empower Mexican Americans through historically based claims to space and belonging. Goes and Boteo continued this gesture toward culmination and prestige by proposing the monument for a hilltop location on an underdeveloped plot that would have given visitors an entire view of their Chicano community. El Monumento de la Raza was an interpretive center and catalyst for an entire urban project. This slide shows their new social geography with its revivalist buildings and markers that sought an alternative vision of an underdeveloped and neglected area. While only the massive busts of the Aztec eagle warriors reached completion, this new social geography rendered by Boteo documents the blending of European spatial impulses with Mexican modernism, in part an architectural quotation of Parisian urban design. My goal is to document how the artist's appreciation for site-specific public art developed in Europe. That is, Boteo's view of art comes prior to the Chicano debates about Mexican modernist call for people's art. With this temporal rethinking of influence, the European spatial and aesthetic dialogue comes into view, and the grand staircase of El Monumento is seen as a quotation of public staircases in Italy, possibly the Spanish Steps. Boteo's drawing appropriates multiple transnational symbols, designs, and notions of art, bringing Mexico, Mexican America, the United States, and Europe into an international dialogue of cultural production and influence. Boteo presses Renaissance humanism into service for the social empowerment of marginalized populations in Los Angeles, thereby charging differently the indigenous revivalism that he brought from Mexico. Margaret Garcia is a seminal portrait artist from Los Angeles who works primarily in oil and acrylic paint. Her most high-profile public art creation is the Universal Studio City Metro Station, which pays tribute to the Gabrielino Tongva people, the Mexican pioneers, many of which are African descent, and the U.S. immigrants who settled near the spot on which the station was built. Although she studied at Cal State University Northridge, Los Angeles City College, and USC, Margaret Garcia is largely self-taught in the studio workshops of illustrator Hugh Baker, who relentlessly made her practice contour drawing for 5 years, beginning in 1971, and Vernon Wilson and his student Don Ward of the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, who allowed her to paint in their studio every week between 1972 and 1976. When she moved in 1979 to Chicago, Illinois, she continued to sharpen her technical expertise while working in restoration, learning to manipulate different media, such as clay and porcelain. These experiences made it possible for her to begin a professional career as an artist immediately upon returning to Los Angeles in 1983. Garcia's story, then, is not one of before and after Mexico, because she did not begin to paint seriously until late 1972. By that time, she'd already made 2 trips to Mexico, which unintentionally informed her aesthetic sensibility before she picked up the paintbrush. Although it's then difficult to trace direct influences, her travels to Mexico nevertheless provided Garcia with a color palette, a sense of texture, and consistent devotion to portraiture. For example, when asked about her color palette, Garcia often recounts the first time she flew over Mexico City. Looking from the plane window, she noticed the, quote, turquoise-colored houses, pink houses, violet-colored houses. It's crazy, she recalled for me, because back home in Los Angeles, she said, everything is dirt-colored. The buildings and streets look gray and smoggy. She was taken by the brilliant colors found in Arte Popular of Jalisco and Oaxaca, the 2 places she traveled. She purchased textiles, a saturated color, a huipil saturated with pinks, reds, blues, and oranges, a large tree of life whose tree trunk was a neon pink. She embraced the strong, strong color of Mexico, she said, and this high-key color appears in her paintings. Ironically, Garcia also speaks at length about the black clay sculpture of Oaxaca when reflecting on her multiple trips to Mexico. Clearly, this painter who privileges the saturated hues did not find inspiration in the monochromatic clay pottery of Oaxaca. Rather, Garcia's sensibility is informed by the complementary rises and falls of the clay, the thickness of the media, the sensual quality of the finished surface. Indeed, her discussion of the artistic process borrows from the language of sculpture. I quote, "As I paint one painting, I use the other as a palette to sort of smear the paint and build up the surface. And I do that because it creates more tension with the brush, and I can control the texture and the movement on the surface of the image. Canvas absorbs the paint. It sucks up the paint. So it's very difficult to bring the surface up on that. It takes a lot more paint. But once the surface is built up, you can control it the same way you would control frosting on a cake. And so you get this really nice texture in the bristles on the brush. You can also carve the paint onto the surface. I like to manipulate and push the paint." Garcia evinces a mode of influence that is complex and nuanced. The layers of paint allow her literally to carve on the surface of the canvas, as we see here. Similar to Baca's experience in Mexico that empowered the artist to focus on a specific style, Mexico gave Garcia permission to paint the human figure over and over again. As she declares, "I haven't changed my MO. I've always done portraits. I continue to do portraits." Her commitment to the human form emerged during one of her earliest trips to Mexico. Traveling with her mother-in-law in 1974, she visited the architectural sites and museums of Mexico City, and an exhibition of student work at La Plaza de Bellas Artes surprised her. It consisted of large portraits of Mexico's politicians. She did not anticipate that portraiture could be so moving, so powerful, so expressive, and so colorful. The massive size and coloration conveyed grandeur beyond an individual biography. It was as if Mexico's history was also being told through individual faces. This observation inspired her attention to the portraits of her family and friends and community, especially her notable series, Un Nuevo Mestizaje. In this series, Garcia connects Mexican and Chicano cultural mixedness with the growing experience of mixed-race peoples in the United States. This celebration of mixed racial identities and heritages challenges the American paradigm, we are either black or white, and the presumed racial homogeneity of our nation. It offers another portrait of American experience. Her commitment to biographic expression should not be mistaken for romanticism or that dreaded death of painting. Rather, Garcia's work reflects on indigenous philosophy and Lakesh, you are my other me, an epistemology in which the self is known through and in relation to others. In this way, individual portraits register as community identity. By way of conclusion, I address Garcia's role in shepherding Mexican art and artists across the US-Mexico border because it further complicates the exchanges between Latin America and the United States. In the 1980s, she met Justina Fuentes, Juan Alcaraz, and Laura Armenta, as well as Rodolfo Morales, the great Mexican painter and contemporary of Francisco Toledo and Rufino Tamayo. Garcia became their coyote, securing passage across the border, not illegally as the vernacular expression implies, but under the radar of US and Latin American art history. Judy Baca also played the role of the coyote in the 1980s and 90s, and working independently, they and other Chicanos arranged Los Angeles exhibitions and studio presentations for Mexican artists. By the end of the 1980s, for example, Fuentes was among a group of Oaxacan artists who were regularly featured in Dia de los Muertos celebrations inside museums throughout Southern California. Garcia also played a critical role in bringing Graciela Iturbide to Los Angeles in 1986 for the photo book project A Day in the Life of America. And that encounter produced Iturbide's well-known White Fence series. These transnational collaborations extended an already entrenched yet unexplored route of migration and exchange. This well-traveled path between Mexico and Los Angeles began in the 1930s when Alfredo Ramos Martinez, Siqueiros, and Jose Clemente Orozco painted murals in Southern California. Contemporary Mexican art not only had a prominent place in Los Angeles commercial art galleries, but it contributed to the success of Los Angeles dealers such as Bernard and Edith Lewin, who in 1997 donated their collection to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, LACMA, making it one of the main U.S. repositories of Mexican modern art. Los Angeles was not on the periphery of Mexico's art scene, but at its center. Therefore, it's not surprising that Garcia's first encounter with Mexican art occurred on U.S. soil. On one occasion, Garcia saw the work of Remedios Varo on Gallery Row, and it inspired the composition of dark and unknown forces within her paintings. The tidy expectation foundational to this derivative taxonomy about Chicano art is easily challenged as we see that Mexican and Chicano artists traveled a complex transnational exchange across their borders. Borders never seem to contain or control artistic exchanges and otherwise. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome all four speakers back on stage. We have a few minutes for questions and comments, and if we could bring the house lights up a little bit. And I would really appreciate it if you have a question or comment, if we could use the microphone so that the questions are picked up on the webcast. Please raise your hand and we can run a microphone to you, or you can walk to the edges. There are two right here. Well, I will begin really quickly. I was just very excited by two common threads in all your talks. One was how these talks really complicated the binary relationship we've been looking at between the US and Latin America. I really enjoyed seeing Italy and Paris brought in, and even in Sarah's paper, the conversations between Latin American cultures that Downey facilitated by showing the videos to each other. So I thought, to me, that seemed like a new direction that the field might be taking to complicate these discussions a little bit. I also really enjoyed the consideration of artists as interpreters and mediators between cultures. I think that's something we could discuss a little bit more. If you have anything to say about that. I think I saw a hand over here. Yes?
Thank you. I really enjoyed all the papers. Excuse me. One of the things that seems to connect for me, especially the last three papers, is the kind of the use of indigenous themes, indigenous histories, as something that is sort of distinctly American, right? And that kind of nourishes artistic modernity. With Mendieta, with this notion of the homeland, with Downey, you know, the unity of the past and the present. And of course with Otero, with Mexican muralism as an influence. And I guess the first paper does not address that, but I do recall going to to that wonderfully curated show in Newark and seeing that with people like Torres Garcia, you know, utilizing these indigenous themes, and actually remember seeing the show sort of using, you know, woven baskets and things like that, sort of in juxtaposition with these different paintings. And so I think this is a comment, but I hope you'll comment on how it is that that the indigenous gets sort of put into the modern artistic in these, you know, across these four different papers.
Well, I guess I could speak to with you mentioned constructive spirit and the connections of an American type of modernism with indigenous roots, and it's certainly something you see obviously with Torres Garcia advocating for in part the idea of turning the map, inverting the map and looking away from Europe and looking to our own heritage within the Americas. It's something you see in the United States as well, with a number of artists in modernism, certainly heavily influenced by Native American art forms, and for a number of abstract artists in the States, particularly based in the Southwest, there is that was certainly a very important tying connection and looking to pottery and weaving forms as well. So, I mean, that certainly plays a part. And even on the part of someone like Otero, and in Venezuela, there's actually a strong indigenismo movement as well that's actually occurring at the same time. And you even look at early Otero work, it's very much about the landscape and looking at other artists who are also looking to more indigenous themes in Venezuela. So that starts.
Yeah, I want to thank you for that interpretation, because it's quite rare that people see Chicano art's use of indigenous aesthetics as a kind of as a modernist impulse. It's usually read as backward and old-fashioned, and in fact, in conferences and exhibitions that I participated in 2001 in Oaxaca, that was a joint conversation between Chicana and Mexicana artists. The Mexicanas were accusing the Chicanas of, like, you know, could you get out of that? It's old school. So I appreciate your reading. Thank you.
I'll have you go.
Mendieta actually started that connection with indigenous art in Mexico. And when she was a student in Iowa, she would travel to Mexico every summer, and her first silhouettes were made in Mexican archaeological sites. So she had a sort of scholarly interest, but she also felt that this was a way of getting back to the source. She felt of like spiritual energy, but also her own source. Something that she had felt very, you know, absent in her Midwestern surroundings. And so for her, the Tainos in Cuba and indigenous people there were a really important connection with what she felt that she had lost, and a way to bring in a sort of, I think of it as a kind of post-minimalist aesthetic vocabulary to connect with something that was very important to her inheritance.
And adding to that, you know, something I couldn't talk about in this paper, but Downey's experiences in the Amazon, he became fascinated and just very inspired by the forms of sort of temporary architecture, the shabonos of the Yanomami people, and that really he saw in kind of dialogue with these other forms of, whether it is ancient pre-Columbian kind of architecture or other types of, you know, contemporary forms as well that weren't the monumental. They would be temporary. They would be cyclical and part of the land itself in a way. And he sort of was interested in all those forms, particularly the shabono itself.
Yes.
Thank you all for those wonderful papers. I have a question for Mary Kate O'Hare. I was wondering if you could comment a bit more about Kelly and Otero's approach to abstraction in relation or in contrast to what was then dominant in Paris, and especially what the Salon de Réalité Nouvelle promoted. Because I believe you suggested that they sort of like wanted to distance themselves from that, but at the same time they showed there. So I wonder if you could comment about that, in a way, complicated relationship with what's happening in Paris in abstraction.
Sure. No, that's a terrific question. And in fact, I think both Kelly and Otero found it really problematic that they were exhibiting in this salon, actually, and is why they, in fact, I think there's a comment Kelly said, if they really knew what I was doing, they would never have accepted my work into the salon. And part of that stems from sort of that reference I made to the fact that Really, by late 40s, early 1950s, the salon had really come under the influence of a approach to abstraction that was very inventive, in the sense not abstracting from nature, but a type of abstraction that's inventive, a concrete type of abstraction. Like Augustin Herbin, for example, you saw in one of the reproductions I showed, was really, when I use that term militant, I mean, it was almost sort of this militant approach to it. And so on the other side, though, Kelly and Otero, I see, and this is one of the things I think conceptually that links them, and I didn't have a chance to go into it, but thinking about Otero's development, really starting off in the early 40s as a landscape painter and being very tied to, looking at the structure and looking at nature, and in essence, kind of pulling out the essence of nature, is also something that Kelly, too, is deeply engaged in. And particularly in Paris, you see him developing this approach to really focusing on different, be it the architecture, be it, stacked tables, for example. I'm thinking of some of his sketches, really, again, getting to the basis of form, though, via nature. Kelly even said at some point, I'm paraphrasing him, something that I'm not an inventor, I'm looking, I'm translating what I see. And I think, although, of course, they both certainly produced pure abstractions, sort of the original foundational basis ultimately comes from, I think, a real perception of looking at the outside world. And so in that case, it really separated them from a lot of the artists exhibiting at the salon. So yeah, the realm of abstraction in Paris at that period is fascinating and really complicated. And as I worked on this paper, I'm just thinking we've really got to dig deeper into these layers and complications. So thanks for that question.
Hi, my question's for Karen. I was really interested in the way that you kind of portray some of these relationships between Chicano artists and Mexican artists as like sounding really lovely, collegial, collaborative, and all of that. And because it's like the standard narrative that I've always heard has always, and that a lot of people I know experience, was the one of like, rechazo, like when you have that first contact. So I guess sort of like, oh, you Chicanos aren't properly schooled, you're in these very backward modes of representation, and and we can figure out access to the art world without you. So is there something about the conditions that changed, I guess, in the 80s or 90s, or the period that you're talking about, or that these artists were in a position where they were kind of able to mediate, or am I just kind of like totally misreading?
I think you're right. It has to do with those particular artists being in a position to mediate. Judy Baca has a spark, and in the 1980s, the spark is doing very well. The funding is quite secure, coming from the county and the city, and from multiple foundations outside of municipal streams of revenue. And so when after the Great Wall is completed or funding is shut down, as I was suggesting, the funding comes through a correctional facility and from the Army Corps of Engineers. After that shut down in 83, she shifts to a couple other projects, and one of them is the World Wall, the World Without Fear. And that's a traveling installation that is a global exchange between artists that she meets, for example, in Finland and Russia, et cetera. But when she hooks up with artists in Mexico, it's more productive for them to come here. And she has the infrastructure to do so, right? And so she brings Marta Oropesa and others from the 80s forward. And with Margaret Garcia, she was employed at the Photo Center in LA. And I think that facilitated, not that she had an infrastructure, but that position facilitated relationships, and specifically the relationship with Graciela Iturbide. 3 different sources contacted Margaret Garcia saying, there's a Mexican photographer that has a project and she needs a location for shooting. Can you do this? And the first time she says, no, don't know anything. The second call comes from Self-Help Graphics, which is another community-based organization still in existence, one of our first in Los Angeles, mostly a print shop. When Self-Help Graphics co-founder Sister Karen calls Margaret, she says, okay, I'll think about it. She gets a call from another person who says, we have a Mexican photographer. They need a site for this Day in the Life of United States book project funded by Kodak. And she finally says, okay, I'll connect her up. I'll connect this person with my niece in White Fence community of East LA. And she finds out it's Graciela and Turbide, and they begin then a decade-long relationship, painting and photographing each other and exchanging art. But it's because Margaret's at the photo center that she gets those calls over, and from those 3 different sources, she's identified as someone who would know something, not because she's working in that, she's not doing photography. So I think you're right. There is still a contentious relationship between some Mexican and Chicano artists, and it gets more problematic in the 90s when the lack of historical context, or that historical context seems to be forgotten. But usually it's when these artists have some kind of infrastructure that the relationships are very fruitful, and they still do continue.
Thank you for all the papers. They're really wonderful. And my question was spurred by Mary Kate's presentation, but anyone could respond. I guess in considering these various transnational case studies, I wonder what effect they have on national art histories. Clearly, transnational perspectives open up and destabilize neat national narratives. But there are national differences that must still be accounted for. And I say this because of all the artists discussed today, Ellsworth Kelly sort of stands out like a sore thumb, in the sense that, at least from what I understood, sort of stated, I'm not involved in a social project. Even though you didn't really discuss Otero's understanding, or that wasn't part of your presentation, just sort of how he saw his project socially. I wonder how do you account for that difference?
Well, I think on one level, Otero certainly had, saw his work as very much connected to what was happening in, on one level, Venezuela, and even says that he's hoping that he's creating an abstraction, this idea of modernism, that is something he can give back to his country. He certainly couched it on one level in that way. On another level, though, Otero and Kelly certainly, I think, meet on this Otero, I should say, on an idea of also working with a language that had universal relevance, this idea of unity, an idea of universalism through abstraction, so that it was one that wasn't necessarily completely encased by national borders as well. And I think that sometimes in his art and in his writings, you see that there's, I haven't quite figured that out either, exactly how you can be both universal and also both local, but there is that idea, I think, at the core of his work. Similarly with Torres Garcia, we see a similar type of idea too, this idea of through the local reaching the more universal. Kelly, is again coming out of a very different context as opposed to, say, what was happening in Caracas and what Otero experienced. And for him, again, this idea, the art project, this very modernist type of project of really getting back to the essence of art, also shared by Otero as well, was really of greater importance to him. So, yeah, I think that is a big difference between these artists and exactly how they attribute, this work and this language, to their work. Nonetheless, though, I think, there still are some really interesting intersections, nonetheless, between them. I think it also points to, for me, the real flexibility of abstraction as a language to communicate different levels. You also have artists at the same period who would attribute, maybe socialist ideas to abstraction, but also maybe spiritual goals as well. And I think it really, speaks to the fact that, it's always important to go back to the context and go back to, for me, in terms of approach, like what was it the artist was attributing to their ideas of abstraction, kind of letting them lead the way to the concepts, ultimately, I think that are really important, because just because it's abstract, it doesn't mean the same, necessarily the same thing, and I think that sometimes that happens. It's a very layered language, so.
I think we should squeeze in one more question. I know there's one in the back. Yes.
Thank you for those papers. So it was really, really interesting. And I really congratulate the Smithsonian American Art Museum for this symposium. It's really incredible that this is happening, and also that there's so many, that the discussion is really so broad, that there's so many media represented and artists really from all of the Americas in a sort of, equal context. I had a question for Sarah Montross. I really liked your paper, and I think I like it for several reasons. One is that it really questions some received knowledge that there was, in the 70s, very little space for Latin American artists in what is called, the mainstream art scene in New York and in the States, right? And that's something that you question with your paper, and with the presence of Downey at the Whitney or at the Smithsonian, even some years before, and that also Gabriela Rangel questioned at a really good paper she presented in February at CAA on Downey and Boccia and Mata Clark, right? It was really good research. But if I'm understanding well your paper, I think you attribute the fact that that Downey was so visible in the 60s and 70s in the US to the fact that he was also working with a new medium, right? And there was that excitement of video as a new art form. I don't think, it's interesting to think about why some artists get noticed and some others don't, even though their art forms might be equally interesting, or, I think, I don't know, is it your point that because that part of what made Downey really visible in the 70s was that he was working in a new art form?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was visible in that world, but that world is quite small. And I think I could have stressed more about how sort of cowboy, to use that phrase again from yesterday, the scene was, especially at the Everson. I'm working there now on their video collection, and it's just incredible what they were able to do with very little resources, and they were able to do it because people were watching, but they were able to pull off a lot. So that has been very, very interesting. And in the Whitney, I think too, what is really important, particularly with Downey, is he's had some very important champions, including John Hanhart and David Ross, and those two figures in particular stand out in my mind in terms of bringing Downey into the museum. And I don't want to again say that Downey's only impact within the museum at all, because I see him as so transcendent in all different sort of environments, and including his connection as well to artists in Chile, which I obviously wasn't able to develop, but he has these amazing interactions and projects that he does with artists in Chile at the same time. So he's just a very special artist in that way, I think.
Definitely. And I had another question. I think it was, I'm wondering if in the reception to the 1976 show at the Whitney, there are any references to the censorship he suffered a year earlier at the America Society.
Not that I read.
I thought that was very interesting, because the America, it's super interesting that the America Society, that the Center for Inter-American Relations then, who had this super strong ideology of fostering hemispheric understanding, had censored his work, Anaconda Map of Chile, and then a year later, he's at the Whitney, which is super close to the America Society, geographically in New York, presenting this work that is all about sort of looking across the hemisphere. I think it's sort
It
of
is very-
mind-blowing, really.
Very compelling. I mean, the difference, too, is that the map of Chile had a very direct statement, and Video Transamerica, I think, is a lot broader, and including that one video that I talked about that included the performers from Chile. That was, I've only found one review that mentions it, and in that it was just sort of in passing. So the reaction in relation to the context of where it was displayed, I think, makes a huge difference in that case. That's a very good point.
Well, I want to allow everyone a chance to break their lunch.